Have you ever felt a strange sense of unease as you walked down to the beach, looked out at the ocean, and wondered, is there something hiding under the sand? If you haven't thought about it, then perhaps after reading this story, you won't be so quick to let yourself go into the waves. The Long Island serial killer case, which began with the first bodies found on the beach, has shaken not only Long Island, but the entire United States. A serial killer has been hiding in the shadows, committing strange murders that no one could have expected. But what makes this case different is the way and place he chose to act. The bodies were not hidden in deep woods or in deserted houses, but were lying out in the open on the beach, where people come to rest and relax. One of the strangest and most disturbing murder cases of the 21st century. Imagine you're walking on the beach, the waves lapping at your feet, and suddenly your eyes catch sight of something strange in the sand. You bend down, expecting to be a shell or an old shoe, but it's not. As you bend down closer, you realize it's a hand, and it's not the hand of someone who drowned. A body that's been buried in the sand for how long? Maybe days, maybe years. And it's just one of many bodies that the killer has hidden in the most unlikely place, a Long Island beach. And that's where this story begins, where a strange investigation begins, where suspicions, dark truths, and inexplicable events gradually unfold. Long Island, a name that might make you think of great beaches, barbecues with friends and family, or simply a place to relax in the sun. But beneath its peaceful beauty, Long Island hides secrets that only those who dare to look the truth in the face can bear. In 2010, as the summer heat slowly dissipated and the ocean breeze blew gently across the golden sands, the beach cleanup crew at Gilgo Beach could not forget that day. They came to work with the simple belief that nothing unusual would happen. However, they encountered a sight they would never forget, a hand reaching out from the sand. "Good morning, Gilgo Beach," one of the crew shouted as if it was just another day at work. But when he bent down and saw something strange sticking out of the sand, he couldn't help but be startled. He hastily picked up the shovel and dug a little more, not thinking that what he was doing would open up an unbelievable chain of events. It was the first body. But don't think that everything was as simple as a normal murder. No, this body was not just a sign of a case, but a sign of a series of cases that were much more sophisticated. It was not just a disappearance. It was a deliberate, planned murder, and the killer had buried the victims under the sand as if they were worthless, ironically and coldly. When the police arrived at the scene, they discovered that the body was not simply a drowning or an accident. No, it was calculated. A victim was deliberately killed, then buried under the sand, where only someone working at the beach could accidentally discover it. And that's when the truth began to emerge. A buried body was not uncommon. But as the police continued to search the area, they discovered not just one body, but 4. Then 5. And the number of bodies kept growing, and with each body, the questions kept coming. Who was behind all this? And why did he choose these women? Why were the victims buried in the sand? As investigators began to analyze the cases, one thing that stood out was that all the victims had something in common. They were women, and all were involved in prostitution. However, that wasn't the only answer. What would make a killer choose victims who seemed easy? Was he on purpose, or was he simply a psychopath? Investigators quickly realized that this was no ordinary case. The bodies were not hidden in a shed or under a thicket of bushes. Rather, they were buried deep in the soft sand of a Long Island beach, where people still happily strolled and enjoyed the sea on hot summer days. These clues seemed contradictory. On one hand, the cold, cruel murderer. On the other, the peacefulness of sunny beaches. What would make a killer want to commit such atrocities right where people come to relax and have fun? Was he sending a message? Perhaps he wanted to prove that no one could hide escape from him, even in the most public and crowded places. That was one of the things that investigators could not explain at first. Not everyone thought that this killer could hide in the bright sunlight and crowded Long Island, but the truth could not be denied. The first victim, an important piece. The first victim discovered was a woman named Maureen Brainerd Barnes. She was a 25-year-old woman who lived on Long Island and worked as a prostitute in the sex industry. She went missing in July 2007, and when her body was found, investigators began to question the connection between the other disappearances. This story is not just about one body. With each new body discovered, the investigation becomes more exhausting and complicated. The police faced a host of challenges, from a lack of useful clues to the lack of clues that prevented them from identifying the perpetrator. Some investigators even began to wonder, could this be a series of murders by a serial killer? Other victims and possible theories. As the police began to search for other victims, suspicions began to surface. Perhaps the crimes were not committed by one person, but rather by a larger criminal network. Were other killers lurking in the crowd, perhaps part of a larger crime spree? Soon, some began to talk about a theory that investigators couldn't help but consider. Could the killer be someone in the sex trade? Since all the victims were women who worked in the industry, many believe it could be a case of revenge. Some even thought that an organized crime group might be behind the murders. However, this theory was quickly dismissed when police could not find any clear connection between the victims and the sex workers. The case continued to be haunted by mystery, and theories kept emerging. Doubt and the endless investigation. With each new murder discovered, the investigation became more difficult. Long Island police began searching for traces on beaches, deserted areas, and places with few people. However, despite searching everywhere, they were still unable to determine the identity of the killer. To this day, no one can explain what happened over the years. The victims remain just names on a case list, and the name Long Island serial killer remains obscure in the dark. Stay tuned for the next installment of the Long Island serial killer series, where you'll discover new details from the investigation, hidden truths. With each new body discovered, the strangeness of the Long Island murders grew. Police were faced with not just one case, but a series of murders, each seemingly unrelated but with a distinct commonality. Women who worked in the sex trade, brutally murdered and buried in the sand. Initially, police could not explain the connection between the murders. All of the victims were young women who lived and worked on Long Island, and while their professions made them easy targets, the meticulousness and secrecy of each murder led investigators to suspect that a killer had a specific plan. The investigation began with the discovery of Maureen Brainerd Barnes in 2010, when the first body was found on Gilgo Beach. However, the police quickly realized that the body was just part of a long series of unsolved murders. Less than a year later, other bodies were found in other areas of the beach nearby. The case quickly became a major obsession, not only for the police, but also for the local people. Police pursuing vague clues. When the murders continued without a clear trace of the culprit, the police began to suspect that the killer might have committed these crimes long ago, with careful preparation and careful planning. The clues they collected were not enough to clear up the matter, but led them to an important conclusion. The killer might not be a spontaneous killer, but someone very intelligent and may have carefully studied the habits of the victims. Investigators noticed that all the victims had one clear thing in common. They were all women who worked in prostitution. This gave rise to the theory that the killer might have been a client of the victims, or at least someone connected to the industry. However, this theory could not explain all the questions raised because not all the murders showed signs of a violent attack or anger during the encounter. This prompted investigators to change their approach. They decided to investigate not only those connected to prostitution, but also to expand the scope of the investigation to include everyone in the area where the victims worked, including neighbors who might have witnessed something suspicious without knowing it. The interrogations continued, but the answers were still lacking in clarity. All the theories failed to lead to any definite conclusions, and the police began to feel stuck. The first break. After months of fruitless investigation, a new lead suddenly emerged. A local resident contacted the police with vital information about a man they had seen several times near the area where the victims were killed. He was described as a tall, thin man with dark hair and a cold expression. Although few details were given, the information opened a new ray of hope for the investigation. Investigators added the man to their list of suspects and began to verify the statements of other witnesses. Some residents remembered that the man may have been in the area in the days leading up to the murders, and they began to link him to previous disappearances. As investigators continued to dig up information from witnesses, new leads began to emerge. Some people said they had seen the man driving an old truck, and others said they had heard loud arguments between him and the victims. However, no one could definitively identify the man. However, the information they gathered opened up a new direction in the investigation. Investigators decided to focus on finding the truck and investigating the driver. They hoped that by gathering more clues, they could solve the case. When the clues still don't connect. With each new piece of information, investigators began to feel a little hopeful. But it wasn't long before they realized that despite the new details, the clues still didn't quite connect into a complete story. The suspect appears to have no clear connection to the victims, and there is no evidence to suggest that he may have been responsible for the murders. Police continue to investigate the complex relationships and shady phone calls from the victims' pasts, but despite their long efforts, they have not been able to identify the killer. Some suspicions have arisen that there may be more than one killer involved into these cases, and this added to the confusion of the investigation. As time passed, and as fatigue began to creep in on the investigation team, the story of the Long Island serial killer continued to sink deeper into the darkness. Although clues were gathered, a final conclusion could not be reached. This case has become one of the greatest mysteries that the Long Island police have ever faced. With the impasse and the ever-increasing suspicions, the Long Island serial killer case continues to be an unsolved question. The police have searched everywhere from deserted areas to crowded locations, but the killer still eludes their grasp. Although the investigation has not yet reached a conclusion, one thing is clear: this killer is still hiding somewhere, continuing to act undetected. Will the investigators find the truth? Or will this case continue to be an unsolved mystery? Stay tuned for the next installment of the Long Island serial killer saga, where clues continue to be. After discovering the number of murders on Long Island and their connection to women in prostitution, investigators gradually realized a terrifying truth. The bodies buried in the sand were not random cases or crimes committed in a fit of rage. On the contrary, they appear to be part of a meticulous plan, the deliberate method of a mentally disturbed killer. The investigation began to change direction. The initial clues, which had been trivial and unrelated, were now seen as parts of a larger picture. This forced investigators to change their approach to the case. They no longer simply searched for the culprit in the crowd or followed the usual suspects, but began to consider the psychological aspects of the killer. Police face a meticulously planned killer. Long Island police gradually realized that this was no ordinary murder. To kill someone and then hide the body under the sand on a beach where anyone could stumble upon it required an understanding of human psychology, of how to deal with suspicion, and of how to create the perfect crime scene without leaving a trace. From the beginning, investigators noticed a strange feature in these cases. There was no sign of a struggle. There were no wounds on the victims' bodies that would indicate that they had resisted the killer. This revealed something important. The victims had been killed in a state of surprise, and they had absolutely no idea that they were in danger. This killer was no ordinary killer. A killer who commits murders in a fit of rage may leave traces of a fight behind. But this was not the case with the Long Island serial killer. Police gradually realized that this killer had an extremely calm and calculated method. Perhaps he carried out these murders systematically, step by step, and in a special way that no one could imagine. The victims were chosen purposefully. One of the first theories that came up was that this killer chose his victims purposefully. Not all women were his targets, but only women who worked in the sex industry, who the killer believed would be easy targets for him. Another theory was that he chose women who had separate lives, who were easily overlooked, and who no one cared about when they went missing. This allowed the killer to feel he could act without facing questioning or social attention. This was no coincidence. The victims of the Long Island serial killer had a clear commonality. They were women who worked in the sex trade, lived simple lives, and could be considered unimportant. Although they were socially ignored, they were ideal targets for a psychopath killer who saw them as easy prey. Another notable detail in these cases is that there was no sign of restraint or torture. The victims were killed quickly and efficiently. They had no time to react, to call for help, or to attempt to escape from the killer. This suggests that the killer was able to put his victims into a state of panic, leaving them unable to fight back against their impending death. Strange clues, the elaborate hiding. With each murder, investigators are faced with the same big questions. Why did he choose the beach to hide the bodies? Why were the victims buried in the sand, where they could have easily been discovered if someone had paid attention? There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just bodies hidden in the sand, in the hope that no one would discover the secrets he had hidden. One theory is that the killer had a good understanding of the Long Island area, and he knew that these beaches were deserted at night. He chose these areas to hide the bodies, where people rarely came and no one noticed the disappearance of these women. It was a brilliant plan because no one expected a killer to hide in public and easily escape police surveillance. The police were faced with a big question. Was he a local who had some knowledge of these deserted beaches? Or was he an outsider who came to Long Island to commit murders, then quickly left without a trace? Investigators began to investigate all of the victims' relationships and immediately realized that the killer might not have just one target. He could be a professional predator who can recognize the weaknesses of his victims and exploit them to commit crimes. Reinvestigations, expanding the scope. With the theories becoming increasingly difficult to solve, the police decided to expand the scope of their investigation. They searched not only for the killer in the Long Island community, but also looked at similar cases in other areas of the country. This killer may have committed murders elsewhere and learned how to avoid police attention. This led to a major question. Was the Long Island serial killer part of a larger crime network, or was he simply a solo killer with a method and plan that no one could predict? Investigators contacted criminal psychologists and behavioral analysts to help decipher the killer's behavior. Although they had many theories, each one only led them in the wrong direction. And while the investigation became more and more complicated, one question remained unanswered. Could this killer have continued to act without being detected? With a case without a trace, victims meticulously murdered, and no clues left behind, the Long Island killer remained a great mystery. The deeper the investigators delved into the investigation, the more they realized that this was no ordinary murder. It was the case of a psychopath killer who may not have killed out of pure rage, but as a carefully calculated act, a perfect strategy to escape attention. The investigation continued relentlessly, but with each new clue, the hunt for the killer became more difficult than ever. The killer is still lurking somewhere in the shadows, continuing to strike fear into the hearts of everyone living around Long Island. Will the police be able to solve this case? Or will the Long Island serial killer forever remain one of the unsolved mysteries? After 3 years of investigation with no clear leads on the perpetrator, the Long Island serial killer case began to fade into obscurity. Investigators were exhausted and tired, while the victims' families waited for answers that never seemed to come. But, as in all murder investigations, when all hope seemed lost, a new light could appear. In the spring of 2013, when a Long Island serial killer case seemed to have hit a dead end, an unexpected clue emerged. Something small and unseen in the early days of the investigation could now be the key to unlocking the mystery. It all started with an unlikely source of information, an anonymous phone call. Anonymous call and new leads. The call came from a woman with a hoarse voice, saying she had vital information about the Long Island serial killer. However, it was not the call itself that caught investigators' attention, but the small details the woman shared. She told them that she had met a man who would later become her suspect of the murder. According to the woman, the man had mentioned a place near Gilgo Beach, a little-known area that could easily hide a person without being detected. This led investigators to suspect that the killer might be someone who knew the geography of Long Island very well, and that he might be hiding in the crowd, continuing to watch and strike when the opportunity presented itself. The information from this anonymous call sent investigators back to Gilgo Beach, this time not to search for bodies, but to see if there was anything unusual in the area that they had not yet explored. They began a comprehensive investigation of people associated with the Gilgo Beach area, not only focusing on the previous suspects but also expanding the scope to new subjects. A man in strange trips. With the details from the anonymous call, investigators began to focus on a man named Joseph Brewer. Brewer was a man who lived near the Gilgo Beach area, and the woman in the anonymous call confirmed that she had met Brewer at a bar on Long Island sometime before. She said that Brewer matched some of the descriptions given by the killer, and she also revealed that he had been to a secluded area near the beach several nights before the murder. Police began to monitor Brewer and found that he frequently traveled to the secluded area the woman had mentioned. Brewer also had a history of suspicious behavior, although there was not enough evidence to link him to the murders. However, Brewer's strange travels and his connection to the Gilgo Beach area began to raise significant suspicion. Police continued to monitor Brewer and discovered that he had a habit of visiting the area late at night, even after everyone had gone home. This was unusual behavior, especially since previous investigations had found that many of the murders occurred on dark nights when the beach was deserted. Searching for other clues and sudden death. The investigation did not stop with Brewer. Investigators decided to expand their search, asking people who lived in the Gilgo area and who might have witnessed strange behavior in the nights before the murders. This led them to another person, a man named John Bittrolf. Bittrolf was a Long Island resident with some connections to the area. He also had a criminal record that involved violent crimes, but nothing directly related to the Long Island murders. However, it is worth noting that Bittrolf had been in the Gilgo Beach area at times that coincided with the murders. Several witnesses testified that they had seen Bittrolf in the area the nights before the bodies were discovered. As police continued to dig deeper into Brewer and Bittrolf, an unexpected discovery shocked everyone. Another victim was discovered near the beach area, a victim who police believed had been killed in the same manner. These clues proved that the case was not over and that the killer was still on the loose. The killer and new methods. As the case continued, investigators realized that this killer was no ordinary person. He had a very clear strategy in choosing his victims and how he killed. Not only did he kill brutally, he also knew how to hide the bodies so that they would not be discovered. He knew the beach area well, knowing when was the right time to act without being noticed. Police began to realize that the killer might have a relationship with some people in the sex industry. The victims, women who worked in the industry, may have been targeted because they were easily accessible and no one cared about them when they disappeared. Other theories have been put forward that the killer could be someone in the sex industry, someone with a criminal history, or simply someone who had a clear understanding of the women's behavior. What investigators have yet to answer, however, is the real motive behind the murders. Was it personal revenge, or was it the sick satisfaction he found in killing? New investigation and positive signs. While the investigation has not yet reached a clear conclusion, one thing is undeniable. New clues and unexpected discoveries are bringing the police closer and closer to identifying the culprit. Details about Brewer, Bittrolf, and the Gilgo Beach area are giving the investigation a clear direction. Investigators have also been re-examining witnesses and calls the victims made before they disappeared. These clues have made important connections, helping police realize that they may be dealing with a killer who committed not just one murder, but a series of murders that have been planned for a long time. With each new clue, the case becomes more complicated. But no one can deny that a new step has been taken in this investigation. The killer, while still on the loose, has begun to leave behind clues that police will eventually find. Chapter 4 Conclusion. The Long Island serial killer investigation continues. With new clues emerging, police are beginning to have hope that the case will soon be solved. The killer is still at large, but the clues he left behind are helping investigators get closer to the truth. Will the killer be caught and the murders end? Or will he continue to lurk in the shadows, carrying secrets that will never be revealed? 30 years later, hundreds of investigations, countless interviews, and thousands of hours of relentless searching, the Long Island serial killer remains unsolved. But that all changed in the summer of 2023, when a breakthrough brought new hope to the case that left the community baffled and heartbroken. The first step. On a June morning in 2023, as the sun was just rising, a call came in from one of their top forensics experts that the investigation team couldn't ignore. It was a call they had been waiting for, a sign that the Long Island serial killer, who had eluded them for more than 30 years, might finally be exposed. The call wasn't from an anonymous tip or someone who had been in contact with the victim. Instead, it was a revelation from a trusted source, a behavioral criminologist with years of experience analyzing serial killers. He offered a new analysis of the killer, suggesting that the killer may be hiding among the unsuspecting. He even believes that the killer has left behind clues that only crime analysts can pick up. The killer may have sent subtle signals during the course of his crimes that investigators have missed for years. Details that were previously mere coincidences now offer a new path. Part of the killer's strategy may have been to skillfully construct cases with similar characteristics, like pieces in a game he had planned in advance. The unanswered question, however, after all that has been discovered in more than 30 years, one question remains unanswered. Why? Why are prostitutes targeted? Is there a deeper reason, or is the killer simply testing his limits by killing these vulnerable victims? Throughout the investigation, experts have found that there is one thing that all serial killers have in common: a patience, a meticulous way of carrying out their actions. And in the case of the Long Island killer, it may not have been simply a desire to kill, but to test the investigators, to make them think twice about every move. The killer may have been observing the investigation, following up on every lead, and only when he felt safe did he continue his killing spree. This left investigators even more baffled. How could they catch someone who left no obvious traces, who did not show up, who did not give away any information that could lead to him? The final clues, the killer unmasked. As the investigation continued, one of the most notable developments was the analysis of the calls the victims made before they disappeared. Each call seemed to be an important piece of the puzzle. These calls were more than just goodbyes or normal instructions. Some of them contained strange details, like incomplete sentences or perhaps unconscious instructions about where the victims intended to go. Of particular note was the last call made by Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the first victim. Before she disappeared, she called a friend to say she would be back in a short time, but then her call was abruptly disconnected. To this day, investigators have not been able to determine why the call was cut off. They suspect that Maureen may have realized something was wrong at the last moment, and that is when the killer appeared. Since then, each call before the victim's disappearance seemed to have become a clue, but none of them were enough to lead to the killer. This only made investigators more aware of the sophistication of the killer and new strategies. From these clues, crime analysts began to realize that the killer may have changed his strategy over time. He may have changed the way he committed the murders to avoid detection, like a chameleon that can change to suit the situation. Once the clues start to come in, he can easily change his attack method, like a predator that knows how to choose its targets and hunt them from a distance. This has led investigators to speculate that the killer may be a very calculating killer, and that he may be in a period of self-challenge. If this is the case, the investigation will not stop at finding a killer, but a hunt where investigators will have to constantly come up with new clues, new theories to keep the killer on the radar. Will the killer be caught? As investigators continue to search, they begin to realize that this case may never have a simple conclusion. The Long Island serial killer has become one of the most elusive serial killers in the history of crime. And with each new clue, investigators are faced with more difficult questions. Police have conducted multiple searches, canvassed different areas, and even used advanced technology to analyze data related to the Long Island area. But despite advances in investigative technology, the case remains unsolved. The killer continues to be a ghost in people's lives, and to this day he has not been caught, creating a new strategy in the manhunt. Since the last clues were revealed, the police began to build a new strategy in the hunt for this killer. They decided not to rely solely on information from calls or witnesses, but instead to focus on gathering information that could identify the killer through other channels. Could genetic analysis technology be used, or even modern methods such as analyzing data from social media applications? To find the killer, investigators began to look for clues that might have been overlooked before. All they knew was that he was still hiding somewhere, and this killer would not stop until he was discovered. This story does not end here. Stay tuned for the next installment of the Long Island serial killer. The search expands to learn more about the intense investigation and unsolved mysteries of the hunt for this dangerous killer. With new clues and a relentless search, will the police finally catch the culprit? Join us as we explore the next installments of this docuseries, where the truth may gradually come to light, and where the mystery of the Long Island serial killer will continue to unfold. Stay tuned for the next installment of True Crime. Don't miss it.